Sometimes the forest holds secrets that can change everything we thought we knew about our past. Janet Morrison had walked these Montana mountain trails for 20 years, finding peace in the wilderness after losing her husband in a logging accident. One morning, she found something that didn't belong, a huge steel safe covered in moss, sitting alone between the pine trees like it had been waiting for her. The folks back in Pine Ridge laughed when she told them about it. They said she was seeing things, that grief makes people imagine impossible sights. But Janet knew what she saw was real. She packed her tools and went back to that safe, determined to open it no matter what it took. What she found inside would prove that some secrets are worth keeping buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of Janet Morrison's cabin, casting long shadows across the worn pine table where she sat nursing her second cup of coffee. The gold wedding band on her left hand caught the light as she turned the pages of yesterday's newspaper, though she wasn't really reading. Her mind kept drifting back to that impossible discovery in the forest. 3 days now since she'd stumbled across something that had no business being where it was. Pine Ridge, Montana, stretched out below her cabin in the valley, a town of maybe 800 souls clinging to life in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. Once it had been a thriving logging community. But those days were as dead as the sawmill that sat rusting beside Clearwater Creek. Now most folks scraped by on seasonal work, government checks, or the occasional tourist dollar from hunters passing through. Janet had lived here all her life, 43 years, watching the town slowly hollow out like a tree eaten from the inside by beetles. She'd married Henry Morrison when she was 22, right out of college with her forestry degree. He'd been the kind of man who could make anything grow, their garden, their love, their dreams for the future. They'd planned to have children, maybe build a bigger house up on the ridge where they could see the whole valley spread out, like a green quilt. Those plans died with Henry III. Years ago, when a widowmaker branch came down during a routine timber survey. One moment he was calling out measurements to his crew, the next he was gone. The paramedics said it was instant, that he wouldn't have suffered. Janet supposed that was meant to be a comfort, but it only left her with questions that would never be answered, and conversations that would never finish. She touched the wedding ring, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. Henry would have believed her about the safe. He'd been the one person in her life who never questioned her instincts, who trusted her knowledge of these mountains completely. Without him, she felt like she was speaking a language no one else understood. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and recognized the number for the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department. "Morning, Tom," she said, answering on the third ring. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been elected to his position more through lack of opposition than any particular qualification for the job. He was a decent enough man, Janet supposed, but he had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life avoiding difficult decisions. "Janet, I've been thinking about what you said the other day at Murphy's." Tom's voice carried that careful tone people used when they thought they were talking to someone who might be coming apart at the seams. "About that thing you found up in the mountains." "The safe, Tom. You can say the word." A pause. "Right. Well, I was wondering if maybe you might want to talk to someone. You know, professionally. The county has resources for folks who are dealing with grief." Janet cut him off. "Tom, I know the difference between seeing things and actually seeing something. That safe is real as the coffee cup in my hand. Janet, honey, I've lived in these mountains my whole life. My daddy logged these woods, and his daddy before him. There's no way someone got a bank vault up there. The terrain alone—" "I'm not asking you to believe me, Tom. I'm just telling you what I found." Another pause, longer this time. "Maybe you should talk to Marie down at the diner. She's been worried about you, says you haven't been eating regular." Janet almost smiled at that. Marie Caldwell had been trying to feed everyone in Pine Ridge since she took over the diner from her parents 20 years ago. She was one of the few people in town who still treated Janet like a human being instead of a tragic figure to be pitied or managed. After Tom hung up, Janet sat in her quiet kitchen and made a decision. She'd spent 3 days replaying that discovery in her mind, wondering if maybe everyone else was right and she was losing her grip on reality. But every time she closed her eyes, she could see that safe as clear as day, massive, green with moss, sitting in a small clearing like it had grown there. She pulled on her hiking boots and grabbed her day pack from the hook by the door. If she was going crazy, at least she'd go crazy on her own terms. The trail to the safe started behind her cabin and wound up through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Janet knew every root and rock along this path. She'd walked it thousands of times over the years, first with Henry, then alone after he died. It was her sanctuary, the place where she could think clearly and feel connected to something larger than her grief. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and her breath made small clouds as she climbed. Somewhere above her, a hawk circled on the thermals rising from the valley floor. The familiar rhythm of walking began to settle her nerves. Out here, away from the worried looks and careful voices of town, she felt like herself again. It took her 45 minutes to reach the spot where the main trail branched off toward the old fire lookout. Most hikers continued straight, but Janet had discovered a game trail years ago that led to a hidden meadow where she and Henry used to picnic. Yesterday, following that same trail, she'd found something that shouldn't exist. She pushed through a stand of young aspens, their leaves already beginning to turn gold at the edges, and stepped into the small clearing. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked around, half expecting to find nothing but forest floor and fallen logs. But there it was. The safe stood exactly where she'd left it, massive and impossible. It was easily 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, its steel surface mottled green and brown with decades of rust and moss. Ferns grew from cracks in its base, and a vine had wrapped itself around one corner like it was trying to pull the thing back into the earth. Janet approached it slowly, the way she might approach a wild animal that could bolt at any moment. She ran her hands over the metal surface, feeling the reality of it under her palms. The combination dial was seized with rust, and she could barely make out numbers beneath the corrosion. On the front, just above the handle, someone had etched the initials JT with what looked like a knife blade. She circled the safe, looking for clues about how it had gotten here. The ground around it was undisturbed, except for her own footprints from previous visits. No tire tracks, no gouges from heavy machinery, nothing to suggest how 2 tons of steel had ended up in the middle of nowhere. As she knelt to examine the base more closely, something caught her eye in the brush nearby. A piece of paper, water-stained and partially decomposed, but with marks that looked deliberate. She picked it up carefully, recognizing it as part of an old map. Most of the details had weathered away, but she could make out what looked like elevation markers and the partial outline of a surveyor's grid. Janet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't random. Someone had brought this safe here with a purpose, and they'd wanted to be able to find it again. She spent another hour examining every inch of the clearing, but found nothing else except a few scraps of what might once have been rope. As she prepared to leave, she took one more look at the safe, trying to memorize every detail. Whatever story this thing held, she was going to figure it out. The walk back to town gave her time to think. Tom Bradley might not believe her, and half the town might think she was losing her mind, but Janet knew she'd found something important. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out what it was. By the time she reached Murphy's diner for lunch, she'd made up her mind. Whatever it took, she was going to open that safe. The next morning, Janet loaded her truck with every tool she thought might help. Crowbars, a sledgehammer, bolt cutters, and a battery-powered angle grinder she'd borrowed from her neighbor. If the safe had been sitting in the forest for decades, rust might have weakened it enough that brute force could succeed where finesse failed. The drive up the old logging road took 20 minutes, bouncing over ruts and dodging fallen branches until she reached the trailhead. From there, it was another 45 minutes on foot to reach the clearing where the impossible safe waited. It looked exactly as she'd left it, moss-covered and ancient, like some kind of forest shrine. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed before, scratches in the metal that might have been deliberate marks, areas where the rust had been disturbed recently. Someone else had been here, and not that long ago. Janet set down her tools and began a systematic examination of the safe. She positioned the angle grinder carefully and began cutting. The high whine of the tool echoed through the forest, sending squirrels chattering up the nearest trees. It took 3 hours of patient work, stopping frequently to let the grinder cool and clear metal shavings from the cut. But finally the first hinge pin gave way. As she prepared to tackle the second pin, something in the brush caught her eye. A scrap of paper, yellowed with age and partially hidden under a fallen log. She picked it up carefully, recognizing it immediately as part of an old topographical map. Most of the detail had weathered away, but she could make out what looked like elevation markers and survey points. In one corner, barely legible, were the initials JT and a date, June 1952. Janet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't just a random piece of trash. It was connected to her safe, to Joshua Templeton, to whatever had happened here 70 years ago. She tucked the map fragment into her pocket and returned to work on the second hinge. By early afternoon, both pins were cut through. The safe's door was held in place now only by the ruined lock mechanism and its own weight. Janet positioned her largest crowbar in the gap between door and frame and began to apply leverage. The metal groaned and protested, but gradually she felt something give. Years of rust and corrosion had weakened the lock enough that sustained pressure might break it completely. She braced her feet against the safe's base and pulled with everything she had. With a sharp crack that echoed through the trees, the lock mechanism finally failed. The heavy door swung open with a screech of protesting hinges, revealing the safe's dark interior. Janet's hands shook as she pulled out her flashlight and peered inside. The beam illuminated stacks of papers, some in manila folders, others loose and yellowed with age. At the bottom of the safe sat a metal box about the size of a shoebox, its surface green with verdigris, but otherwise intact. She reached for the nearest folder and opened it carefully. Inside were surveyor's maps, more detailed than the fragment she'd found outside. These showed the entire northern section of the valley, with property lines marked in red ink and elevation contours traced in blue. Several areas were circled and marked with notations in a neat, precise hand. The next folder contained what looked like official correspondence, letters on government letterhead, legal documents, and carbon copies of Joshua Templeton's replies. Janet couldn't make out all the details in the forest light, but she caught enough to understand that Templeton had been in some kind of dispute about mining rights and land use. It was the metal box that made her breath catch in her throat. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the decades, was a compass. Not a modern hiking compass, but an antique surveyor's instrument made of brass and steel. Engraved on its face were the initials JT and the year 1952. But it was what she found beneath the compass that changed everything. A small leather journal, its pages filled with Templeton's careful handwriting, documenting something that would explain not only the safe's presence in the forest, but why an entire family had vanished without a trace. Janet sat back on her heels, the journal trembling in her hands. She'd wanted answers, but looking at the careful documentation spread around her, she realized she might have found more than she'd bargained for. Whatever Joshua Templeton had discovered, whatever he'd thought important enough to hide in a safe in the middle of the wilderness, it had cost him everything, and now, 70 years later, it might cost her too. She began to read, and with each page, the comfortable world she'd known began to crumble around her. By the time she finished, the sun was setting through the trees, and Janet Morrison understood that she was no longer just a grieving widow looking for purpose. She was the only person alive who knew the truth about what had happened to the Templeton family. The question was whether Pine Ridge was ready to face that truth, or whether the people who had buried it once would try to bury it again, along with anyone who threatened to dig it up. Janet carefully repacked the safe's contents, her mind racing with implications. She'd come here looking for answers to a simple mystery. Instead, she'd uncovered evidence of something much darker, something that reached into the present day and touched people she'd known and trusted her entire life. As she hiked back down the mountain in the gathering dusk, one thought kept repeating in her mind: Joshua Templeton hadn't hidden that safe to keep something secret. He'd hidden it to keep himself and his family alive. And it hadn't worked. Janet spread the contents of Joshua Templeton's safe across her kitchen table, each document a piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. The brass compass sat at the center like a talisman, its needle pointing steadily north through the decades. She'd spent most of the night reading Templeton's journal, and what she'd learned had changed everything she thought she knew about Pine Ridge. According to his careful notes, Joshua Templeton hadn't been just another logger trying to make ends meet. He'd been a trained surveyor with an eye for geology, and in the spring of 1952, he'd made a discovery that would have made him wealthy if it hadn't gotten him killed first. The maps told the story in red ink and elevation marks. Templeton had identified what he believed to be a significant mineral deposit in the mountains north of Pine Ridge. Not gold or silver, but something potentially more valuable, a rare earth element that was just becoming important for military applications. In the early days of the Cold War, his journal entries grew increasingly excited as he documented his findings, then increasingly worried as he realized what those findings might mean. The final entries, dated just days before his family's disappearance, spoke of threats and warnings from unnamed parties who wanted him to abandon his claims. Janet rubbed her eyes. Exhausted from a sleepless night but too wired to rest, she needed to understand more about the people mentioned in Templeton's notes, needed to trace the connections between past and present. The Pine Ridge Library was small, but it had archived copies of local newspapers going back to the town's founding. She found librarian Beth Harrison reshelving returns in the history section. Beth was a few years younger than Janet, a transplant from Missoula who'd moved to Pine Ridge for the slower pace and stayed for reasons she'd never quite explained. Janet, you're up early. Researching something interesting. Local history. The Templeton family. They lived here in the early 50s. Beth's expression grew curious. That's the second person this week asking about them. Dr. Webb was in here Tuesday pulling all the same files. Janet felt a chill. Dr. Webb was researching the Templetons? Seemed pretty focused on it. Spent half the day with the microfilm reader, making copies of newspaper articles. Beth led Janet to the archives section. What's your interest in them? Just curious about some old property records I came across. Janet tried to keep her voice casual. What kind of articles was Dr. Webb copying? Oh, the usual small-town stuff. Social announcements, business notices. Though there was one article that seemed to get his attention, something about mining claims being disputed. Janet's pulse quickened. Do you remember which issue that was? Beth pulled out a box of microfilm spools. Let me see. June 15th, 1952, I think. Here you can look for yourself. The microfilm reader was an ancient beast that probably predated Janet's birth, but she managed to navigate to the right date. The Pine Ridge Gazette had been a weekly publication, 4 pages of local news and advertisements. She found the article Beth mentioned on page 3, Local Surveyor Disputes Federal Land Claims. The brief article described a conflict between Joshua Templeton and the U.S. Forest Service over mineral rights on federal land. Templeton claimed his surveys had been conducted legally and that he'd filed proper claims, while government officials insisted he'd trespassed on restricted areas. The dispute was scheduled for a hearing that never happened, because by then, Templeton was gone. Janet continued scanning issues from the summer of 1952, looking for any mention of the Templeton family's departure. She found it in the July 22nd edition. Buried at the bottom of page 2, Local Family Relocates to Eastern Opportunities. The article was barely 3 sentences long, stating that Joshua and Anna Templeton and their daughter had moved to Virginia to pursue new opportunities. It read like a press release rather than news reporting, as sanitized and vague in a way that raised more questions than it answered. But it was the advertisement on the facing page that made Janet's blood run cold. Mountain View Development Company seeks qualified investors for exciting new venture in natural resource extraction. Proven reserves, experienced management, ground floor opportunity. Contact P.O. Box 247, Pine Ridge, MT. Mountain View Development, the same company that had purchased Templeton's land for below market value just weeks after his disappearance. Janet felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture she didn't want to see clearly. She spent the next 2 hours copying everything she could find about the Templetons, Mountain View Development, and the mineral rights dispute. By the time she finished, she had a stack of photocopies that painted a disturbing picture of a man who'd discovered something valuable, tried to claim it legally, and been eliminated for his trouble. The walk home took her past Murphy's Diner, where she could see Marie through the window, setting up for the lunch crowd. Janet almost kept walking. She wasn't sure she was ready to share what she'd learned, but something in Marie's wave made her change her mind. "You look like someone who's seen a ghost," Marie said when Janet sat down in her usual booth. "Maybe I have." Janet ordered coffee and a sandwich she probably wouldn't eat, then pulled out one of the photocopies. "Marie, do you remember a company called Mountain View Development?" Marie's face went still. "Where did you hear that name?" "It's in some old newspaper articles about the Templetons. They bought Joshua Templeton's land right after he disappeared." "Lord have mercy." Marie sank into the opposite seat. "I haven't heard that name in 40 years. You know about Mountain View?" "My daddy worked for them summer of '52. That's how I know it was a bad business." Marie lowered her voice. "Daddy never talked about what he did for them. But I remember he came home angry every night. Said they were stealing from dead men." Janet felt her chest tighten. "What do you mean, stealing from dead men?" "I don't know exactly. I was just a child. But I remember him having words with Mr. Bradley, Tom's grandfather, about something that wasn't right. After that summer, Daddy never mentioned Mountain View again. Acted like it never happened. Tom Bradley's grandfather." Janet tried to process this new information. The Bradley family had been in Pine Ridge for generations, had held positions of authority for as long as anyone could remember. If they'd been involved with Mountain View Development, Marie, is there anyone else who might remember that summer? Anyone who worked for Mountain View or knew what they were doing? Marie thought for a moment. Old Pete Garrison might remember something. He's in his 90s now, lives out at the county nursing home. His mind comes and goes, but he has lucid days. Janet felt a spark of hope. A witness, someone who'd been there and might be willing to talk. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. The compass and journal were just the beginning. Somewhere in that safe's contents was evidence that would explain not just what happened to the Templetons, but who was responsible. As she walked home, Janet noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. The way certain buildings in town seemed to have been built around the same time, in the mid-1950s. The memorial plaques in the park that honored families who'd contributed to Pine Ridge's growth and prosperity. The subtle deference people showed to certain names. Certain families who'd somehow prospered while others struggled. For the first time in her life, Janet Morrison was seeing her hometown with clear eyes. And what she saw made her understand why Joshua Templeton had hidden his evidence in the middle of the forest. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep in town. The Pine Ridge County Care Center sat on a hill overlooking the town, a low brick building surrounded by gardens that were brown now with approaching autumn. Janet found Pete Garrison in the solarium, dozing in a wheelchair with a blanket across his legs and sunshine warming his weathered face. At 93, he was one of the oldest residents in Pine Ridge, a man who'd seen the town transform from a frontier logging camp to its current state of genteel decline. "Mr. Garrison." Janet touched his shoulder gently. "I'm Janet Morrison. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something." Pete's eyes opened slowly, pale blue and surprisingly alert. He studied Janet's face for a moment, then nodded toward an empty chair. Henry Morrison's wife, he said, his voice thin but clear. Sorry about your loss. Henry was a good man. Thank you. Janet settled into the chair, unsure how to begin. Mr. Garrison, I wanted to ask you about something that happened a long time ago. The summer of 1952. Do you remember a company called Mountain View Development? The change in Pete's expression was immediate. His entire body seemed to shrink into the wheelchair, and his eyes darted toward the hallway, as if checking to see who might be listening. Why would you want to know about that? He whispered. I found something that might be connected to them. Something that belonged to Joshua Templeton. Pete was quiet for so long that Janet wondered if he'd forgotten the question. But when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of decades-old fear. I was 23 that summer. Needed work bad. My pa had died the winter before, and I was trying to keep the family farm going. Mountain View was hiring, paying twice what anyone else offered for day labor. What kind of work? They said it was survey work, helping them map mineral deposits in the mountains. We'd hike up to sites they'd already identified, dig test holes, take samples. Simple work, or so I thought. Pete looked out the window toward the mountains, his eyes focusing on something Janet couldn't see. The crew chief was a man named Edgar Henley. Hard man, ex-military. He made it clear from the first day that we weren't to talk about what we were doing, not to our families, not to anyone in town. Said it was proprietary information, that other companies would steal their claims if word got out. Janet pulled out a photocopy of the newspaper article about Templeton's mineral rights dispute. Did you ever hear them mention Joshua Templeton? Pete's hands began to shake. Jesus Christ, girl. Where did you get that? The library. It's public record, Mr. Garrison. Public record. Pete laughed bitterly. Nothing about that summer was public record. We signed papers saying we'd never talk about what we did, where we went, what we found. They said it was standard for mining operations. But you remember Templeton. I remember the day Henley came back from town, madder than a wet cat. Said some local surveyor was causing problems, filing claims on land that didn't belong to him. Said the man was going to learn what happened to people who interfered with serious business. Janet felt cold, despite the warm sunlight. What did he mean by that? Pete was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. 3 days later, Henley took me and 2 other men up to a site we'd never worked before. Remote area, maybe 10 miles north of town. When we got there, we found Templeton waiting with the surveyor's transit, mapping the area like he owned it. What happened? Henley told us to wait while he talked to Templeton. They walked off into the trees and we could hear them arguing. Then there was a gunshot. Pete's hands were shaking badly now. Henley came back alone. Janet's heart was pounding. What did you do? What could we do? Henley said it was self-defense, that Templeton had pulled a gun first. Said if we kept our mouths shut, no one would ever know we were there. But if we talked, Pete shook his head. We were young men with families, needed work. We kept quiet, but the Templeton family disappeared that same week. His wife and daughter. Pete closed his eyes. I heard about that later. Henley said they'd been relocated for their own safety, that they'd been given new identities somewhere back east. I wanted to believe it. God help me, I needed to believe it. Janet felt sick. The picture Templeton's journal had painted was becoming horrifyingly clear. A man discovers valuable mineral deposits, tries to file legitimate claims, and gets murdered for his trouble. His family disappears to cover up the crime, and everyone who was there keeps quiet out of fear or complicity. Mr. Garrison, who was behind Mountain View Development. Who was giving Henley his orders? Pete opened his eyes and looked directly at Janet. You're Henry Morrison's wife. You've lived in Pine Ridge your whole life. You know these people. Tell me. The money came from back east, but the local operation was run by men you'd recognize. Tom Bradley's grandfather was the company's local agent. Dr. Webb's father handled the legal paperwork. Even the bank president was involved, helping launder the money through legitimate accounts. Janet felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. The pillars of Pine Ridge society, the families that had run the town for generations, had built their prosperity on murder and theft. The mineral deposits Templeton found, did Mountain View ever extract them? Oh, they tried. Spent 2 more years up there, bringing in heavy equipment, digging test shafts. But the deposits weren't as rich as they'd hoped. War ended, demand dropped, and the whole operation shut down. By then, everyone who knew the truth had been bought off or scared into silence. Pete reached out and grabbed Janet's wrist with surprising strength. I kept quiet for 70 years because I was a coward. Because I had a wife and children, and I was afraid of what would happen if I talked. But I'm 93 years old now, and the only thing I'm afraid of anymore is meeting my maker with this sin still on my soul. He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. I wrote this down 5 years ago, when I first started having heart problems. Names, dates, everything I could remember. I always meant to give it to someone who could do something with it. Janet took the paper with trembling hands. It was a detailed confession, written in Pete's shaky handwriting, documenting everything he'd witnessed that summer of 1952. The truth needs to come out, Pete said. Those people destroyed a family and built their fortunes on blood money. It's time Pine Ridge faced what it really is. As Janet left the care center, Pete's confession burning like a coal in her pocket. She realized her simple discovery in the forest had become something much larger and more dangerous. She wasn't just uncovering the past anymore. She was threatening the foundations on which her community had been built. And people had killed once to protect those foundations. There was no reason to think they wouldn't kill again. Janet sat in her truck outside the care center for 20 minutes. Pete Garrison's confession spread across her steering wheel, trying to absorb the full magnitude of what she'd learned. The names on Pete's list read like a roster of Pine Ridge's founding fathers, men whose families still held positions of influence, whose descendants ran the bank, the sheriff's department, the town council. She drove home on autopilot, her mind churning with implications. When she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Sheriff Tom Bradley's patrol car parked across the street. He was sitting behind the wheel, making no attempt to hide his presence. Their eyes met through her windshield, and he touched the brim of his hat in what might have been a greeting or a warning. Inside her cabin, Janet spread all her evidence across the kitchen table. Templeton's journal, the surveyor's compass, Pete's confession, the newspaper articles, the property records. Each piece added weight to a story that painted her hometown as built on a foundation of murder and conspiracy. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Marie's number. "Janet, honey, you need to be careful." Marie's voice was tight with worry. "Tom Bradley came by the diner after you left, asking questions about what you and I discussed. He seemed real interested in whether you'd mentioned finding anything unusual in the mountains." Janet felt a chill. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing that wasn't already common knowledge." "But Janet, he wasn't alone. Dr. Webb was with him, and they were talking to Old Man Henley's son, Edgar Jr. You remember Edgar runs the hardware store now. Edgar Henley Jr. Janet's mind raced back to Pete's story about Edgar Henley Sr., the crew chief who'd killed Joshua Templeton. The family was still in Pine Ridge, still part of the community's power structure. "Marie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. When we were talking about your father working for Mountain View, did I get the feeling you knew more than you were saying?" A long pause. "Can you come to my house tonight, after the diner closes? There are some things I should have told you sooner." Marie lived in a small house behind the diner, a neat cottage with flower boxes and lace curtains that spoke of a woman who'd made peace with living alone. When Janet arrived after dark, Marie was waiting with coffee and a manila envelope that looked like it had been hidden away for decades. "I lied to you this morning," Marie said without preamble. "Not about the important things, but about how much I remembered. I was 8 years old that summer, but some things you don't forget, no matter how hard people try to make you." She opened the envelope and pulled out a black and white photograph. It showed a group of men standing in front of a large truck loaded with equipment. Even in the faded image, Janet could make out the Mountain View Development logo on the truck's door. "My daddy kept this, hidden in the bottom of an old toolbox. I found it after he died, along with some other things he'd saved from that summer." Janet studied the photograph. She recognized some of the faces, younger versions of men she'd known as pillars of the community. In the center of the group stood a man she didn't recognize, tall and stern-faced with military bearing. "That's Edgar Henley," Marie said, pointing to the central figure. "And that's Tom Bradley's grandfather next to him. The man on the right is Dr. Webb's father." "Marie, why didn't your father ever say anything about what happened?" "He tried to, once. About 10 years after that summer, when the guilt was eating him alive. He went to the state police, tried to tell them what he'd witnessed. 3 days later, his logging truck went off a mountain road. Brake failure, they said. He spent 6 months in the hospital and never walked right again." Janet felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. "They tried to kill your father?" "They tried to remind him what happened to people who talked too much. It worked. He never mentioned Mountain View development again. But he kept these photographs, kept some documents he'd taken from the job site. I think he always hoped someday there'd be a reckoning." Marie pulled out more items from the envelope, work orders with Mountain View letterhead, timesheets showing when crews had been at various mountain locations, and most damning of all, a partial list of equipment that included firearms and explosives. "They weren't just doing geological surveys," Janet said, studying the equipment list. "They were preparing for something much bigger. Daddy said they were planning to blast access roads into the mountains, set up a full mining operation. But after Templeton was killed and the family disappeared, everything changed. The equipment disappeared too, shipped out in the middle of the night, like they were covering their tracks." Janet looked again at the photograph, focusing on the faces of the younger men. These weren't hardened criminals, they were her neighbors' grandfathers. Men who'd gone on to raise families and run businesses and attend church every Sunday. The banality of evil, she supposed. Ordinary people who'd made terrible choices and then spent decades living with the consequences. "Marie, there's something I need to tell you. I found Templeton's safe. I opened it. Marie's coffee cup rattled against the saucer. Dear God, Janet, what was inside?" Janet told her everything, the journal documenting Templeton's mineral discoveries, the evidence of his attempts to file legitimate claims, his growing fear in the days before his death. She showed Marie Pete Garrison's confession, watched the older woman's face grow pale as she read the details of Joshua Templeton's murder. "So it's true," Marie whispered. "They killed him for what he found, and his family. Pete said they were relocated, but I don't think any of them survived. I think they were all murdered to keep the secret." Marie was quiet for a long time, staring at the photograph of her father, standing with men who'd committed murder for money. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I can't let this stay buried. Those people deserve justice, even if it's 70 years too late. Janet, these families still have power in this town. If they killed once to protect their secret, what makes you think they won't kill again?" As if in answer to her question, a car door slammed outside. Through the lace curtains, Janet could see a police cruiser parked in Marie's driveway. Sheriff Tom Bradley walked up to the front door and knocked. "Ladies, I know you're in there," he called out. "We need to talk." Janet looked at Marie, seeing her own fear reflected in the older woman's eyes. The past had caught up with them, and the descendants of murderers were standing on the doorstep. Marie opened the door with the kind of forced calm that came from decades of serving difficult customers. "Evening, Tom. Kind of late for a social call." Sheriff Bradley stepped inside without invitation, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. He nodded to Janet, his expression unreadable. "Evening, ladies. Sorry to bother you, but I've been getting some concerning reports about activities up in the mountains. Seems someone's been trespassing on federal land, possibly vandalizing historical sites." Janet kept her voice steady. "What kind of historical sites?" "Oh, you know how it is. Old mining claims, abandoned equipment, that sort of thing. The Forest Service takes a dim view of people disturbing these areas without proper permits. I wasn't aware there were any historical mining sites in that area," Janet said carefully. Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's the thing about history, Janet. Sometimes there are things that happened that didn't make it into the official records, things that are better left undisturbed." Marie set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. Tom Bradley, if you have something to say, why don't you just say it instead of dancing around like a politician? Tom looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since entering the house. Ladies, I'm trying to help you understand the situation. There are people in this town who remember the old days, who understand that sometimes the past is better left buried. They're concerned that certain discoveries might be misinterpreted. Misinterpreted how? Janet asked. Well, take the Templeton family, for instance. Now, I know there have been some questions about what happened to them, but the truth is they left town voluntarily. Had some trouble with debts, I understand, and the family decided to start fresh somewhere else. Sometimes these old stories get embellished over the years, turned into something more dramatic than they really were. Janet felt a surge of anger. That's interesting, Tom, because the evidence I found tells a very different story. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tom's casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. What evidence would that be, Janet? Before she could answer, Marie stood up abruptly. I think it's time for you to leave, Tom. This is my house, and I don't appreciate you coming here and making threats. I'm not making threats, Marie. I'm trying to prevent a situation that could get out of hand. There are people who've built good lives in this town, raised families, contributed to the community. It would be unfortunate if old rumors and misunderstandings destroyed what they've worked so hard to build. Janet couldn't keep quiet any longer. Built on what, Tom? Built on murder and stolen land? Tom's face went white. That's a very serious accusation, Janet, the kind that could get someone in legal trouble if they can't back it up. I can back it up. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Tom stared at Janet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new edge. I hope you understand what you're getting yourself into. This isn't just about some old bones that might be buried in the woods. This is about the stability of an entire community. People have children, grandchildren, businesses that employ half the town. Sometimes the greater good requires that we let sleeping dogs lie, and sometimes the greater good requires that we tell the truth about what happened to innocent families. Tom nodded slowly, as if Janet had confirmed something he'd suspected. Well, I've said my piece. I hope you'll both think carefully about the consequences of your actions, not just for yourselves, but for everyone in Pine Ridge. After he left, Marie locked the door and pulled the curtains closed. They know, she said simply. Whatever you found in that safe, they know you have it. Janet felt the weight of the evidence scattered across Marie's coffee table. Photographs, documents, confessions that painted a damning picture of the town's hidden history. The question is, what are they going to do about it? The same thing they did 70 years ago, I expect. Whatever it takes to protect their secret. As if to underscore Marie's point, Janet's cell phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Ask yourself if the truth is worth your life. Janet showed the message to Marie, whose face paled. We need to get this evidence somewhere safe, Marie said. If something happens to us, at least the truth will survive. Where? Everyone in town with any authority is either involved or intimidated into silence. Marie thought for a moment. My sister lives in Missoula. She's a retired teacher, has no connection to Pine Ridge politics. We could send copies to her, tell her to give them to the state police if anything happens to us. It was a reasonable precaution. But as Janet helped Marie make photocopies of the most damning evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already in deeper than they could handle. The families who'd profited from the Templeton murders had spent 70 years consolidating power in Pine Ridge. They owned the bank, controlled the sheriff's department, influenced every major decision in the county. Marie, what if we're wrong about this? What if Tom is right and we're misinterpreting what happened? Marie looked up from the copy machine. Honey, my daddy lived with the guilt of what he witnessed for 40 years. Pete Garrison has been carrying the same burden for 70. Does that sound like men who were covering up a voluntary relocation? Janet knew Marie was right, but the weight of what they were facing felt overwhelming. They were two middle-aged women taking on families that had run Pine Ridge for generations. People who'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their interests. "There's something else," Marie said quietly. "Something I haven't told you about that photograph." She pulled out the black and white image again, pointing to a figure in the background that Janet hadn't noticed before. A young girl, maybe 10 or 12 years old, standing partially hidden behind one of the trucks. "I think that's Lucy Templeton, Joshua's daughter." Janet studied the girl's face, noting the resemblance to the family photograph she'd seen in the courthouse archives. If this was taken during the Mountain View operation, that means she was still alive after her father was killed. For a while, at least. Marie's voice was heavy with implication. "The question is, what happened to her and her mother?" Before Janet could respond, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, so complete that Janet couldn't see her hand in front of her face. Outside, she could hear the sound of car engines running, multiple vehicles surrounding the house. "Marie," Janet whispered, "do you have a back door?" "Through the kitchen." "But Janet, if they're out there waiting—" A spotlight blazed through the front window, so bright it was blinding even through the closed curtains. A voice spoke through a bullhorn, distorted but unmistakably Tom Bradley's. "Ladies, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible and no one gets hurt." "This doesn't have to end badly." Janet grabbed the evidence from the coffee table, stuffing it into her jacket. "Is there another way out?" Marie nodded toward the back of the house. "Root cellar under the kitchen floor. It connects to an old storm drain that comes out near the creek." They made their way through the dark house, guided by Marie's familiarity with the layout. Janet could hear footsteps on the front porch, someone testing the door handle. They didn't have much time. The root cellar was accessed through a trap door, hidden under a kitchen rug. Marie lifted it to reveal narrow wooden steps leading down into musty darkness. The space below was cramped and smelled of old vegetables and damp earth. But Janet could feel a draft that suggested an opening to the outside. "I haven't been down here in 20 years, Marie whispered as they descended. "I hope the tunnel hasn't collapsed." Above them, Janet heard the front door splinter as someone kicked it in. Heavy footsteps moved through the house, voices calling for them to show themselves. She and Marie crawled through the tunnel on hands and knees, feeling their way along earthen walls that scraped their shoulders. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. But finally, Janet felt cool air on her face and saw a faint circle of light ahead. They emerged through a culvert into the creek bed behind the town's main street, muddy and exhausted, but free. "My truck is parked at the diner," Janet whispered. "If we can reach it—" "No," Marie said firmly. "They'll be watching all the obvious places. We need to get out of town completely, somewhere we can figure out our next move." As they crouched in the shadows by the creek, Janet could see flashlight beams moving through Marie's house, searching for evidence of where they'd gone. She realized with a sick feeling that there was no going back now. By running, they'd confirmed Tom Bradley's worst fears about what they knew and what they were willing to do about it. The town where she'd lived her entire life, where she'd married Henry and buried him, where she'd thought she belonged, that town was gone. In its place was something darker, built on secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. "Marie," Janet said quietly, "I'm sorry I dragged you into this. Honey, I've been in this for 70 years, ever since my daddy came home covered in another man's blood. The only difference is now we're finally going to do something about it." They made their way along the creek bed toward the edge of town, carrying evidence that could destroy Pine Ridge's founding families, but knowing that those same families were now hunting them through the darkness. Behind them, Janet could see more lights converging on Marie's neighborhood. A coordinated search that spoke of careful planning and serious intent, the reckoning Pete Garrison had hoped for, was finally coming. But it might cost them their lives to achieve it. They walked for hours along forgotten logging roads and game trails, putting distance between themselves and Pine Ridge. Marie knew the country better than Janet had expected. Decades of living in a small town had taught her every back road and shortcut in the valley. By dawn, they'd reached an abandoned hunting cabin about 15 miles from town, hidden in a grove of aspens where the morning light filtered through golden leaves. The cabin was basic: One room with a stone fireplace, no electricity or running water, but it would give them time to think and plan their next move. Janet spread their evidence across a rough wooden table, while Marie worked to get a fire started. "We need to get this to someone who can act on it," Janet said, studying Pete Garrison's confession. "State police, FBI, someone with authority that extends beyond Pine Ridge. The question is whether we can trust anyone in law enforcement. Tom Bradley's family has been connected to the sheriff's department for 3 generations. Who knows how far their influence reaches?" Janet was about to respond when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching on the dirt road. She moved to the window and saw a familiar pickup truck bouncing over the ruts, Dr. Franklin Webb's blue Ford, the same one he'd driven for the past 20 years. "It's Dr. Webb," she told Marie. "How did he find us?" Marie joined her at the window, watching the elderly historian climb slowly out of his truck. He looked around nervously before approaching the cabin door. "Maybe he followed us. Or maybe someone told him where to look." Marie's voice was tight with suspicion. Dr. Webb knocked softly on the door. "Janet, Marie, I know you're in there. Please, I need to speak with you." "It's important." Janet looked at Marie, who shrugged. They were both armed with kitchen knives from the cabin's meager supplies. Not much protection against a serious threat, but better than nothing. Janet opened the door, keeping her distance from Webb. "Dr. Webb, this is a surprise." He looked older than she remembered, his white hair disheveled and his usually neat clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. His hands shook as he removed his glasses to clean them. "May I come in? What I have to tell you is better discussed in private." Against her better judgment, Janet stepped aside. Dr. Webb entered the cabin and sat heavily in one of the wooden chairs, looking like a man carrying an enormous burden. "I've been looking for you since last night," he said. "Tom Bradley has half the county searching, telling people you're dangerous, that you've stolen valuable historical artifacts." "We didn't steal anything," Janet said. "We found evidence of crimes that were committed 70 years ago." Webb nodded slowly. I know because I've been carrying the same burden for most of my life." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Marie moved closer to the fire, still gripping her knife. "What burden would that be, Dr. Webb?" she asked. "The burden of knowing the truth about what happened to the Templeton family and doing nothing about it." He looked directly at Jenna. "My father was involved in the Mountain View development conspiracy, just as Pete Garrison told you. But there's more to the story, things that even Pete didn't know." Dr. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I've been waiting my entire adult life for someone to ask the right questions. When you came to the Historical Society asking about the Templetons, I knew the time had finally come." He opened the envelope and spread its contents on the table beside Janet's evidence. More photographs, documents with official letterheads, and what appeared to be a detailed map of the northern mountains with specific locations marked in red ink. Mountain View Development wasn't just a local operation, Webb said. It was backed by federal money, part of a classified program to secure strategic mineral resources during the Cold War. The rare earth deposits Joshua Templeton discovered were more valuable than anyone realized at the time. Janet studied the documents. They showed funding authorizations from the Department of Defense, contracts with private security firms, and most disturbing of all, orders that authorized any necessary measures to secure the mineral rights. They had government sanction to kill him. Not explicitly, but the language was clear enough. National security interests superseded individual property rights. When Templeton refused to sell his claims and threatened to go public with his discoveries, he became a security risk. Marie looked up from the documents she was examining. "But his family, what happened to Anna and Lucy?" Dr. Webb's face crumpled with an emotion that looked like shame mixed with relief. "That's the part I've never been able to live with. Anna Templeton was my father's secretary. She'd been helping him with legal research, knew about the mineral surveys, understood what her husband had discovered. So they killed her too?" "No." Webb's voice was barely a whisper. "Anna Templeton is still alive." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Janet felt as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. "That's impossible," she said. "That was 70 years ago. Anna Templeton became Anna Webb. She married my father 6 months after her husband's murder." Janet stared at the elderly historian, trying to process what he'd just revealed. "Your stepmother was Joshua Templeton's widow?" "The marriage was arranged by the Mountain View conspirators. Anna had witnessed too much, knew too many details about the operation. They couldn't kill her without raising suspicions, so they offered her a choice: marry my father and keep quiet, or follow her husband into the ground. And the daughter, Lucy?" Webb pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young girl standing next to a stern-faced woman in a 1950s-era dress. Lucy Templeton became Lucy Webb. She was told her father had abandoned the family, that he'd run off with another woman and left them destitute. She grew up believing her stepfather had saved them from poverty and shame. Janet's mind raced with the implications. "Lucy Webb, is she still alive?" "Very much so. She lives in Billings now, retired after 30 years as a school principal. She's never known the truth about what happened to her real father." Marie was studying the documents with growing amazement. "All these years, the witness everyone thought was dead has been living 2 hours away. Anna made a choice to protect her daughter," Webb said. "She buried the truth so deep that even Lucy never suspected. But Anna never forgot what really happened to Joshua. She's the one who's been sending me documents all these years. Evidence she saved from her first marriage." Webb pulled out the final item from his envelope, a thick journal bound in leather. Its pages filled with a woman's careful handwriting, Anna's diary from 1952. She documented everything: the threats against her husband, the night he was murdered, the coercion that forced her into marriage with my father. "She's been waiting 70 years for someone brave enough to tell her story." Janet picked up the diary with trembling hands. This was the missing piece, the testimony that could corroborate everything they'd found in Joshua's safe. "Dr. Webb," she said slowly, "why are you telling us this now?" "Because I'm 87 years old, and I'm tired of living with my family's sins. Because Tom Bradley and his allies are planning to make you disappear, just like they did Joshua Templeton. And because Anna Templeton Webb called me last night and told me it was time to stop being a coward." The weight of the revelation settled over them like a shroud. The woman they'd been seeking was alive, waiting in Billings with evidence that could finally bring justice for her murdered husband. But getting to her would mean running a gauntlet of people who'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secret. "There's something else," Webb said quietly. "The mineral deposits that started all of this, they're still there. Recent geological surveys suggest they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars at current market prices. The original conspirators' children and grandchildren have been quietly buying up land around the deposits, waiting for the right time to revive the mining operation. So this isn't just about covering up old crimes," Janet realized. "It's about protecting a future fortune," Webb nodded grimly. "Which means they have even more reason now to make sure the truth never comes out. You're not just threatening their family reputations, you're threatening their children's inheritance." Outside the cabin, Janet could hear the sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple engines, moving fast on the dirt road. Dr. Webb heard them too, his face going pale. "They followed me," he said. "I'm sorry. I thought I'd been careful," but Janet was already moving toward the back door, grabbing the evidence from the table. "Marie, we need to go now." But as she reached for the door handle, she could see more vehicles approaching from that direction. They were surrounded, trapped in the cabin with nowhere to run. The reckoning Anna Templeton Webb had waited 70 years for was about to begin. And Janet Morrison was caught in the center of a conspiracy that reached from the halls of federal power to the streets of Pine Ridge. Montana, the vehicle stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, engines idling. Through the window, Janet could see at least 6 trucks and SUVs arranged in a semicircle, blocking any chance of escape. Men climbed out of the vehicles. Some she recognized as local businessmen and town officials. Others were strangers with the bearing of hired muscle. Sheriff Tom Bradley walked toward the cabin. flanked by Edgar Henley Jr. and two men Janet didn't recognize. All were armed, but they hadn't drawn their weapons yet. This was meant to look like a peaceful resolution, at least from a distance. "Janet! Marie! Dr. Webb!" Tom called out. "We know you're in there. Let's talk this through like reasonable people." Dr. Webb moved away from the window, his face grim. "They're not here to talk." Tom's grandfather taught him everything he knew about handling problems like this. Janet frantically stuffed the most critical documents into her jacket pockets. Pete's confession, pages from Joshua's journal, the photographs that proved the conspiracy. If something happened to them, maybe someone would eventually find the evidence on their bodies. "Is there another way out?" she asked Marie. "Root cellar under the floorboards like my house. But it just leads to a storm drain that empties into the creek about 100 yards downstream. They'll be watching it." "Dr. Webb," Janet said urgently. "Your stepmother, Anna, does she have copies of everything?" He nodded. "Complete documentation. She's been meticulous about preserving evidence for 70 years. If we don't make it out of this, she'll continue the fight." Tom's voice came again, closer now. "Folks, we're running out of patience. You've got evidence that belongs to the Historical Society, and we need it back. Come out now and we can work something out." Janet looked around the cabin, taking inventory of their meager resources. A few kitchen knives, some canned food, a small pile of firewood. Not much to mount a defense against 6 trucks full of men with modern weapons. "Marie," she said quietly, "remember what you said about your daddy keeping quiet because he had family to protect?" "Yes, we don't have families to protect. We don't have anything to lose except our lives, and they're going to take those anyway." Marie understood immediately. "You want to go out fighting. I want to go out telling the truth as loud as we can. If we're going to die here, let's make sure everyone knows why." Dr. Webb pulled out his cell phone. "I'm calling the state police. They won't get here in time," Janet said. "But maybe we can get word to someone who can investigate after we're gone." She had an idea, dangerous but potentially effective. Her phone still had battery life, and she'd been recording voice memos as they'd discovered new evidence, a habit from her forestry work where documentation was critical. "I'm going to call the news station in Missoula," she said. "If I can get a reporter on the phone, maybe we can tell our story live on air before they stop us." Outside, Tom was growing impatient. "Last chance, folks. Come out with your hands up and the evidence, or we come in after you." Janet dialed the number for KPAX News in Missoula, praying someone would answer. On the third ring, a woman's voice came on the line. "KPX News. This is Sarah. This is Janet Morrison calling from Pine Ridge. I have evidence of a 70-year-old murder conspiracy involving local government officials, and I'm currently trapped in a cabin by armed men who are trying to stop me from exposing the truth. Ma'am, slow down. Are you saying you're in immediate danger?" "Yes, my name is Janet Morrison. I'm a forest ranger in Pine Ridge, Montana. 3 days ago, I found a safe in the forest containing evidence that a local family was murdered in 1952 to steal their mineral rights. The conspiracy involved the sheriff's department, prominent local families, and possibly federal agents. The descendants of those conspirators are outside this cabin right now, trying to silence me permanently. Ma'am, please, just listen and record this. Joshua Templeton was murdered in July 1952 by Edgar Henley Sr., acting on orders from Mountain View Development Company. The Bradley family, the Webb family, and others in Pine Ridge profited from his death and covered up the crime. His widow, Anna, was forced to marry into the conspiracy to protect her daughter's life. Through the window, Janet could see Tom Bradley talking into a radio. More vehicles were arriving, including what looked like a fire truck, probably to explain away any burning. That might need to be done. The evidence is hidden in Templeton's safe at... Coordinates, Janet rattled off the GPS. Location she'd recorded, speaking as fast as she could. Pete Garrison, a witness to the murder, gave a full confession before he died. Dr. Franklin Webb has been helping cover up his family's involvement for decades. Ma'am, we need to verify. There's no time for verification. They're about to break down the door. Anna Templeton Webb is still alive in Billings. She has complete documentation of everything. Find her, tell her story. Don't let them bury the truth again. The line went dead. Tom Bradley must have had someone cut the phone lines to the area. Dr. Webb was at the window, watching the men outside position themselves. They're not even pretending this is legal anymore. No warrants, no due process. Just like the old days, Marie was checking the back door. The storm drain entrance is clear for now, but I can see men moving through the trees. They'll have it covered soon. Janet made a decision. Dr. Webb, you're the oldest and least mobile. Stay here with the evidence and try to buy us time. Marie and I are going to make a run for it through that storm drain. Janet, I'm 76 years old and haven't run anywhere in 20 years. Then we all go together, or we all stay. I'm not leaving you behind. The sound of splintering wood announced that their time was up. The front door burst open, and Tom Bradley entered with his weapon drawn, followed by Edgar Henley Jr. and two men Janet had never seen before. Hands where I can see them, Tom barked. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Like Joshua Templeton didn't need to get hurt, Janet shot back. Tom's face darkened. That's ancient history, Janet. We're dealing with the present now. The present, where you're planning to murder 3 more people to cover up crimes your grandfather committed? Nobody's planning murder. You 3 are going to have an unfortunate accident. Carbon monoxide poisoning from that faulty fireplace. These old cabins, you know how dangerous they can be? Dr. Webb stepped forward, and Janet was surprised by the strength in his voice. Tom, I've been living with my family's guilt for 80 years. I won't let you add 3 more bodies to the count. Dr. Webb, you taught me in high school. You know I always respected you. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I made it hard the day I decided to tell the truth. Anna Templeton Webb deserves justice for what happened to her family. Edgar Henley Jr. spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the same hard edge his father must have had. Enough talking. Where's the evidence? Janet looked at the man whose father had murdered Joshua Templeton, who'd built his hardware store and his family's prosperity on blood money. You want to know where the evidence is? It's everywhere. Copies have been sent to reporters, to the state police, to federal authorities. Killing us won't stop the truth from coming out. It was a lie, but a convincing one. Edgar's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. She's bluffing, Tom said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. Maybe. But are you willing to bet the family fortune on it? The standoff stretched into long seconds. Outside, Janet could hear more vehicles arriving, voices shouting orders. This conspiracy had grown beyond what a few local families could control. They'd involved outside help, professional cleanup crews who knew how to make problems disappear. But they'd also created witnesses, left trails, generated the kind of attention that might finally expose Pine Ridge's buried secrets to the world. Last chance, Tom said, raising his weapon. Give us the evidence and tell us who else knows about it. Do that, and maybe we can work out a solution that keeps everyone breathing. Janet looked at Marie and Dr. Webb, seeing her own resolve reflected in their faces. They'd come too far and learned too much to back down now. The solution is simple, Tom, she said. Tell the truth about what your family did, and face the consequences like men instead of murderers. Tom Bradley's finger tightened on the trigger, and Janet Morrison prepared to die for a secret that had been buried for 70 years, but would finally see the light of day. The sound of approaching helicopters changed everything. Tom Bradley's head snapped up, his weapon wavering as the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades grew louder. Through the cabin windows, Janet could see his men outside, looking up at the sky, their carefully orchestrated operation suddenly thrown into chaos. State police, Dr. Webb said, with quiet satisfaction. I got through to them before you cut the phone lines. Tom's face went white. You called the state police? I called everyone I could think of. FBI, State Attorney General, even contacted some old friends in the journalism business. Did you really think a 70-year-old retired teacher wouldn't know how to make a few phone calls? The helicopters were circling now, at least 2 of them from the sound. Over a bullhorn, a voice commanded, "This is the Montana State Police." Everyone put down your weapons and step away from the building with your hands visible. Edgar Henley Jr. grabbed Tom's arm. We need to get out of here. If the state police start investigating, it's too late for that, Janet said. The story's already out there. I got through to KPAX News before you jammed the phones. By tonight, this will be on every news station in Montana. Tom looked around the cabin like a trapped animal, his careful plan disintegrating around him. Outside, his conspirators were abandoning their positions, some trying to slip away into the forest before the helicopters could identify them. This doesn't end here, Tom said, lowering his weapon but not holstering it. You have no idea what you've unleashed. The people involved in this, it goes higher than you think. Local law enforcement, federal agencies, companies worth billions of dollars. You think a few old documents are going to bring down something that big? Maybe not, Janet admitted. But it's a start. Dr. Webb moved toward the broken door. Tom, I taught you better than this. Your grandfather made terrible choices, but that doesn't mean you have to compound them. Put down the gun and tell the truth about what you know. Truth. Tom laughed bitterly. The truth is that Pine Ridge exists because of what happened in 1952. The jobs, the businesses, the schools your kids attend, all of it was built with Mountain View development money. You destroy that foundation, you destroy everything. Some foundations deserve to be destroyed, Marie said quietly. The helicopters were landing now, kicking up clouds of dust and fallen leaves. Through the windows, Janet could see state police officers deploying around the cabin, their weapons trained on the men who'd been preparing to commit murder just minutes before. Tom seemed to deflate as he realized his situation was hopeless. The conspiracy that had protected his family for 3 generations was about to be exposed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You don't understand, he said, more to himself than to them. My grandfather wasn't a killer. He was just a young man trying to feed his family during the Depression. When the Mountain View people came to town with their federal contracts and their promises of steady work, he thought he was serving his country by helping murder an innocent family, by following orders from people who said it was necessary for national security. Joshua Templeton was going to sell his mineral surveys to foreign interests, or so they claimed. My grandfather believed he was preventing strategic resources from falling into enemy hands. Janet studied Tom's face, seeing something she hadn't expected, genuine anguish over his family's legacy. What about Anna Templeton? What about Lucy? Were they threats to national security too? Tom's shoulders sagged. Anna Templeton knew too much about the federal contracts, about the real people behind Mountain View development. They couldn't let her go back east and start talking to reporters or congressmen. And Lucy, she was just a child caught in the middle of something she couldn't understand, so your grandfather helped cover up the murders by forcing Anna into marriage with Dr. Webb's father. He thought he was saving their lives. The alternative was... Tom stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Webb picked up the thread. The alternative was killing them too. My father agreed to the marriage because he believed it was the only way to keep Anna and Lucy alive. A state police officer appeared in the doorway, his weapon trained on Tom. Sheriff Bradley, put down your weapon and step outside with your hands visible. Tom looked at his service pistol as if seeing it for the first time, then slowly placed it on the wooden table. It's over, he said quietly. As Tom was led outside in handcuffs, Janet felt a strange mix of triumph and sadness. The truth was finally coming out, but it was destroying people who were as much victims of the original conspiracy as perpetrators of its cover-up. What happens now? Marie asked as they watched the arrest through the window. Dr. Webb was gathering the documents they'd spread across the table. Now we make sure Anna Templeton Webb gets her day in court. She's waited 70 years to tell her story. It's time people listened. A state police detective entered the cabin, introducing herself as Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She was younger than Janet had expected, with sharp eyes that took in every detail of the scene. Mrs. Morrison, I'm the officer who took your call at the news station. We monitored the broadcast and coordinated with state headquarters. Can you walk me through what you've discovered? For the next hour, Janet laid out the entire story, from finding the safe in the forest to uncovering the conspiracy that had shaped Pine Ridge for 3 generations. Lieutenant Chen listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just absorbing the scope of what they'd uncovered. When Janet finished, Chen was quiet for a long moment. This is going to require a massive investigation. Federal agencies, multiple law enforcement jurisdictions, forensic accounting to trace the money. We're talking about reopening a 70-year-old murder case that may have involved classified government operations. Can it be done? Dr. Webb asked. It has to be done. If what you're telling me is true, this represents one of the longest-running conspiracy cover-ups in Montana history. The families involved still hold positions of power, still control significant economic resources. The public has a right to know how those resources were obtained. Janet felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since finding the safe, she believed that justice might actually be possible. What about Anna Templeton Webb? She's the key witness to everything. Lieutenant Chen nodded. We'll have officers escort her back to Pine Ridge. Make sure she's protected while she gives her statement. After 70 years of silence, Mrs. Webb is going to have a lot to say. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Janet took one last look around the small room where the truth had finally broken free. Henry would have been proud, she thought. He'd always believed that secrets had a way of surfacing eventually, that the forest kept its own justice. The safe in the mountains had been Joshua Templeton's final message, a time capsule of evidence that had waited 7 decades for someone to find it and speak for the dead. Janet Morrison, a grieving widow looking for purpose, had become the voice those murdered souls had been waiting for. But the real test was yet to come. Exposing the conspiracy was only the beginning. Now they had to prove it in court, face the power and influence that had kept it buried for 3 generations, and hope that justice delayed wouldn't become justice denied once again. 6 months later, the Pine Ridge courthouse was packed beyond capacity for the trial that had been dubbed the Mountain View Murders by national media. Janet sat in the front row watching as Anna Templeton Webb, now 83 years old but sharp as a tack, took the witness stand to finally tell the story she'd kept buried for 7 decades. Anna looked smaller than Janet had imagined. A white-haired woman in a simple blue dress, who carried herself with the dignity of someone who had survived unimaginable trauma. Her voice was clear and strong as she was sworn in, her hand steady as she placed it on the Bible. Mrs. Webb, the prosecutor began gently, please tell the court your name, as it was in July of 1952. Anna Marie Templeton. I was 26 years old, married to Joshua David Templeton, mother to Lucy Ann Templeton, age 11. And what happened on the evening of July 15th, 1952? Anna's eyes found Janet's across the crowded courtroom, drawing strength from the woman who had finally given her the chance to speak. My husband didn't come home from his survey work in the mountains. He was always home by supper time. Joshua was a methodical man, very precise about his schedule. When he wasn't back by dark, I knew something terrible had happened. The courtroom was completely silent as Anna described the long night of waiting. The dawn search that found only Joshua's surveying equipment scattered near the mineral deposit he'd been mapping. The visit from Sheriff Bradley Sr. and Edgar Henley Sr. that changed her life forever. They told me Joshua had been killed in an accident involving claim jumpers, men who were trying to steal his mineral discoveries. They said his body had been recovered and would be buried quietly to avoid attracting attention from other criminal elements who might target our family. Did you believe this explanation? Anna's laugh was bitter. I believed it because I wanted to, because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. But as the days passed, things didn't add up. Joshua's body was supposedly buried, but I was never allowed to see it, never shown a grave. His personal effects were lost in the incident, including his most prized possession, the surveyor's compass his father had given him. The prosecutor held up the brass compass Janet had found in the safe. "Is this your husband's compass, Mrs. Webb?" "Yes. He had his initials engraved on it when we married, along with the year 1952. He carried it with him every day." "How do you explain its presence in the safe Mrs. Morrison discovered?" "Because my husband hid it there, along with all his evidence about the mineral deposits and the threats he'd been receiving. Joshua was a careful man when he realized people were willing to kill for what he'd found. He made sure the truth would survive even if he didn't." The defense attorney, representing the Bradley and Henley families, rose to cross-examine. "Mrs. Webb, you claim your husband was murdered, yet you married one of the alleged conspirators just 6 months later. Doesn't that suggest your grief wasn't as profound as you're claiming?" Anna's eyes flashed with an anger that had been suppressed for 70 years. "I married Franklin Webb Sr. because Edgar Henley told me it was the only way to keep my daughter alive. He said if I remained Joshua's widow, people would ask too many questions about his death. But if I became the wife of a respectable local businessman, the questions would stop. That's a convenient story, Mrs. Webb. Is there any proof of this alleged coercion?" Anna reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal, the same one Dr. Webb had shown Janet at the cabin. "I kept a diary through that entire period. Every conversation, every threat, every night I lay awake terrified they would decide Lucy and I knew too much to live." The prosecutor took the diary and read several entries aloud. Anna's careful handwriting documenting a reign of terror that had shaped her entire adult life. July 30th, 1952. Edgar Henley came to the house again today. He said there were rumors about Joshua having business partners back east, people who might come looking for him. He suggested it would be safer for Lucy and me if we had the protection of a prominent local family. When I asked what he meant, he said accidents can happen to anyone, especially widows and children living alone. The courtroom stirred as the implications became clear. This wasn't just about covering up a single murder, it was about systematically terrorizing a family into silence. August 15th, 1952. Franklin Webb Sr. proposed marriage today. He was kind about it, said he understood this wasn't about love, that he was offering protection for Lucy and me. When I hesitated, Edgar Henley reminded me that the mountains are dangerous places, that people disappear all the time and their bodies are never found. Anna looked up from the diary. "I married Franklin Webb, not out of love or opportunism, but out of fear. I spent 43 years married to a man who was kind to me and loved Lucy as his own daughter. But I never forgot that our safety depended on my silence." The prosecutor continued with the heart of the case. "Mrs. Webb, what can you tell us about the mineral deposits your husband discovered?" Joshua believed he'd found one of the largest rare earth element deposits in North America. He was working with federal geologists to confirm the findings and establish proper mining claims. The deposits were worth millions of dollars, even by 1952 standards. By today's prices, they'd be worth hundreds of millions. "And who profited from these deposits after your husband's death?" Anna looked directly at the defendant's table, where representatives of the Bradley and Henley families sat with their lawyers. Mountain View Development Company, which was controlled by local families who had advanced knowledge of Joshua's discoveries. They acquired the mineral rights for pennies on the dollar, then waited for technology to advance enough to make extraction profitable. The prosecutor introduced evidence showing how the original conspirators' descendants had quietly bought up land around the mineral deposits over the decades, waiting for the right time to cash in on their grandfather's blood money. "Your Honor," Anna said, addressing the judge directly, "I'm 83 years old. I've lived my entire adult life with the knowledge that my husband was murdered and his killers were never held accountable. I don't care about money or revenge. I just want the truth acknowledged. Joshua Templeton was a good man who died because he discovered something valuable and tried to claim it honestly. His story deserves to be told." The trial continued for 2 more weeks, with testimony from Pete Garrison's recorded confession. expert analysis of the documents found in Joshua's safe, and forensic evidence that corroborated Anna's account. The defense argued that too much time had passed, that the original perpetrators were dead, and that prosecuting their descendants for crimes they didn't personally commit was unfair. But the jury saw through the legal maneuvering. When the verdicts were read, the conspirators' heirs were found liable for wrongful death and conspiracy to defraud, ordered to pay massive restitution to Anna and Lucy, who had learned for the first time at age 81 that her beloved stepfather had been complicit in her real father's murder. As the courtroom cleared, Janet approached Anna Webb, who was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers. The elderly woman looked exhausted but peaceful, like someone who had finally set down a burden she'd carried for far too long. "Mrs. Webb," Janet said when they had a moment alone, "I'm sorry it took so long for someone to listen." Anna took Janet's hands in her own, which were still steady despite their age. "My dear, you gave me something I thought I'd never have, the chance to speak for Joshua. He can finally rest in peace, knowing the truth came out." Outside the courthouse, Janet looked up at the mountains where it had all started, where a moss-covered safe had waited 70 years for the right person to find it. The peaks looked the same as always, eternal and unchanging, but she knew the community beneath them would never be the same. The secret that had shaped Pine Ridge for 3 generations was finally exposed. Justice had been served, even if it came 7 decades late. And somewhere in those mountains, Joshua Templeton could finally rest knowing his story had been told. 1 year later, Janet Morrison stood at the edge of the small clearing where she'd first discovered Joshua Templeton's safe. The massive steel vault was gone now, moved to the Montana Historical Society as evidence of one of the state's most significant cold cases. In its place stood a simple bronze plaque mounted on a granite base, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun. The plaque read, "In memory of Joshua David Templeton, 1924-1952, Anna Marie Templeton Webb, 1926-2023, and Lucy Ann Templeton Webb, 1941-2023. Their courage in seeking truth and justice reminds us that some secrets are too important to stay buried. The mountains keep their own justice." Anna had lived just long enough to see the trial concluded and the truth acknowledged. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the verdict, finally free of the burden she'd carried for 70 years. Lucy, devastated by learning the truth about her father's murder and her stepfather's complicity, had followed her mother within weeks. The family that had been destroyed by greed and violence in 1952 was finally at peace. Marie Caldwell approached through the trees, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the practical hiking boots Janet had bought her for her 72nd birthday. The events of the past year had aged both women, but had also given them a purpose neither had expected to find. "Beautiful morning for a memorial service," Marie said, pouring coffee into 2 metal cups. They'd made this pilgrimage on the anniversary of Janet's discovery every month since the trial ended. A ritual that helped them process what they'd been through and honor the memory of the family they'd helped vindicate. The clearing had become a place of peace rather than mystery, a spot where the forest's secrets had finally been allowed to surface. "I got a call from the State Attorney General's office yesterday," Janet said, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "The federal investigation into the original Mountain View development contracts is complete. Turns out the conspiracy went all the way to Washington, Defense Department officials who were skimming money from classified mineral exploration programs." Will there be more prosecutions? Most of the people directly involved are dead, but there will be congressional hearings about how federal contracts were abused during the Cold War. Joshua's story is going to be part of a much larger examination of government accountability. Marie nodded, settling onto a fallen log that had become their informal bench. He'd be pleased about that. From what we learned about him, Joshua Templeton was the kind of man who believed in doing things the right way, following proper channels. Even when it cost him his life, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the forest sounds that had witnessed so much history. Somewhere above them, a hawk circled on the morning thermals, and Janet remembered the day she'd first found the safe, how the bird's presence had seemed like a sign that she was on the right path. "What about you?" Marie asked. "Have you decided what to do with the reward money?" The state had paid a substantial reward for Janet's role in solving the cold case, and the wrongful death settlement had included a finder's fee that set her up financially for the rest of her life. But money had never been her motivation. "I'm thinking about starting a foundation," Janet said. "Something that helps families of cold case victims, provides resources for people who want to investigate unsolved crimes, but don't know where to start." The Joshua Templeton Foundation? Maybe. Or the Mountain Justice Foundation, something that captures the idea that truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. A squirrel chattered in the branches overhead, scolding them for disturbing his territory. Janet smiled, remembering how the forest creatures had been her only companions during those lonely years after Henry's death. Now she had purpose again. Work that honored both her late husband's belief in justice and Joshua Templeton's sacrifice for the truth. "Marie, do you ever regret getting involved in all this? Your quiet life in Pine Ridge is gone forever." Marie laughed, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees. "Honey, I'm 72 years old. I spent most of my life serving pie and keeping other people's secrets. This past year, I've been on national television, testified in federal court, and helped expose the biggest conspiracy in Montana history. If that's not a good way to spend your golden years, I don't know what is." They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher, warming the clearing and bringing the forest fully to life. Janet could almost feel the presence of the people they'd fought for. Joshua with his surveyor's precision and quiet determination. Anna with her decades of silent strength. Lucy with her innocent trust in the adults who'd shaped her world. As they prepared to leave, Janet touched the bronze plaque one final time. The metal was warm from the sun, solid and permanent in a way that felt right. Some stories deserved to be carved in stone, preserved for future generations who might otherwise forget the price of justice. "Same time next month?" Marie asked as they started down the trail. "Same time next month," Janet agreed. They walked back toward town together, two women who'd found friendship and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. Behind them, the forest kept its eternal vigil, guardian of secrets revealed and protector of truths yet to be discovered. The mountains of Montana had given up one of their mysteries, but Janet Morrison knew they held many more. Somewhere in those peaks and valleys, other stories waited for the right person to find them. Other voices cried out for justice across the decades. She'd learned that the forest kept its own time, its own justice, its own way of ensuring that truth eventually surfaced. And she'd learned that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from looking for treasure, but from refusing to let the past stay buried. The moss-covered safe had been just the beginning. The real treasure had been finding her purpose again, discovering that even in grief and solitude, one person could make a difference. Henry would have been proud, she thought. He'd always said the mountains had their own wisdom, their own way of teaching people what they needed to know. As Janet drove home through the valley that had shaped her entire life, she felt a deep sense of completion. The safe in the forest had been empty of gold or jewels, but it had contained something far more valuable, the truth. And truth, once released, had a power all its own. In Pine Ridge, life would go on. New businesses would open, new families would arrive, new stories would begin. But the memorial plaque in the forest would remain, a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that some secrets are too important to stay buried forever. The mountains would keep their watch, and Janet Morrison would keep hers, knowing that in a world full of buried truths and forgotten victims, someone had to be willing to dig.